sea trout strategies in rivers and streams center around 6 things. Time of day, reading the water, choice of presentation, speed and exposure of the fly, choosing the fly, adapting your gear, and choosing the cast. In this first film, we're going to focus on the first 2 elements, time of day and reading the water, in terms of figuring out how to decode the current to find holding spots and taking spots. Like us, the sea trout has a daily rhythm, which is biologically controlled. When the small fish hatches in the river, it is depending on cover from birds of prey above and places, where it can hide so that it won't get caught by other predators. When the fish becomes bigger and merges up to the river again from outside in the ocean, this behavior is still apparent in the fish. So during the daytime, the fish will find places to hide, and at night they'll move out. Now, when the fish find places to hide, these can be under trees, under vegetation, hollow brinks, tree roots and places like this. We call these spots holding spots. Often these are deeper parts of the river where the fish feel safe. At night time or in the morning, the fish move out into the more shallow parts of the river. Here it's out to guard its territory. Here it becomes aggressive. We call these places for taking spots. So when we're fishing the holding spots, the fish will be hiding. We have to get down deep. Normally, if the river is clear, surface strategies might be possible, but when it's deep and murky, it's my experience that surface strategies are not that effective in the holding spots. Whereas if you move out into the taking spots, which are more shallow, surface strategies become more effective in murky waters. So where the fish is placed during different times of day has a lot to say in terms of choice of strategy. This spot right here has some of the things that we're looking for when we're looking for a typical sea trout, both holding and taking spot. Upstream from me we have a more shallow part, and then here we have the stream being brought together by vegetation falling into the river. So you've got vegetation on the other side, and you've got vegetation that is falling into the water on your own side. If we look further down, the stream becomes more deep, and we have trees on the other side, and we have trees in our own side as well. And roots are particularly good for creating places where the fish can stand. The best sea trout angler is one who is good at keeping himself hidden. This means a lot when you approach the water. If you stand right here on the brink, you become very visible to the fish. It's very easy for them to see you. Whereas if you keep your distance and stay far away from the brink, you become less visible and you fade into the background more easily. Now there's a good point here. You can use your rod. So if the tip of the rod is lying right on top of the brink, this is a good position because you can still maneuver the rod and the line so you don't get caught up in whatever vegetation you have, and still you're far away from the fish. This spot is a place where I have a bit of vegetation out into the river, and I'm standing high on the brink. In a place like this, it's really hard to keep hidden if I stand up here. So what I like to do here is I like to move closer to the river, but then get down so I hide myself behind the vegetation that you find in front of you. In this way you become very hard to see. When we know where the fish might be standing, at what depth and how hidden, it's possible for us to choose a fly and a way to present the fly to the fish. Here we're focusing on the size of the fly and also the depth in which we want to present the fly. This is a deadly spot for sea trout. It has everything we want. You have a deeper part of the current, you have overhanging branches from small trees, and you have a very deep hole in behind me with loads of vegetation in my own side and in the other side. This place is really good for deep strategies. I would choose a nymph, an articulated streamer, a weighted double hook fly, something that would come down. You could also fish it with non-weighted flies on a sinking line, which means the line will drag the fly down, but the fly will be moved easily by the current because it's not so heavy. Fishing spots like these, an entire sinking line or a partly sinking line would be an advantage. Let's have a look at the flies we use for deep strategies. Flies like nymphs with rubber legs and weighted beads. Jig flies with tungsten beads. Big articulated sculpin streamers with weighted heads. And more classic double hooked flies with polar bear wings. And some light streamers as well, but fished on a sinking line. Light streamers like this magog smelt. Let's take a look at the flies we use for surface strategies. Flies like dry flies, classic imitations. These are just emergers and small duns. We've got foam beetles with rubber legs. We've got, this is a dolly fly, it's called dolly parton, which has a foam back, also effective. And then we have the wake flies. This is called a camilla, moves with a wake across the water. Could also be sunker strip flies like this, or these MV discs where you have a flat disc in front and some rubber legs on them as well, and just a bit of weight that just pulls it just under the surface. And in a later episode we're going to show you how to fish all these different flies. Your choice of presentation should be based on how the fish sees the fly. That be whether you fish it on the surface swinging, or if you dead drift it, or if you fish it actively with nymphs or jigs or jerks in either the rod or the line. When you swing the fly, it's important that you get it across to the other bank, as close to the other bank as possible, and then you let the current do the work. So you swing the fly from the other bank across the current and across the stream into your own side. Let it come into your own side and you work it. In this case I'm combining it with nymphing retrieve, which keeps an even pace of the fly when you move it across the water. When dead drifting, you normally cast upstream and you make sure that you just keep tension on the line, just enough so that you get a drag-free drift. It's very important that you try to find the lane in which you think the fish will be lying, so that you get the fly directly into the face of the fish. Some people call these lanes for feeding lanes, and it can be really effective to get the fly right into the nose of the fish. Sometimes it can be really deadly to fish the fly actively, meaning that you pull the line with jerks or you jerk with the rod tip. In this case I'm fishing a sinking line and a very heavy jig fly. The idea is to get the fly down, and then I jig the fly simply just by using the tip of the rod. And then in this case I'm using also a nymph retrieve just to make the fly come a bit upstream. I can let it go down and I can jerk it again if I find some deep holes or deep parts of the current where I believe that a fish will be holding. I want to get down as close to it as possible and then jig the fly right in front of the fish. In this third chapter of our film, Realm of the Sea Run Brown, we focus on the last two aspects of good strategies, namely putting the gear together and choosing the cast. So when we found out where the fish is hiding, what time of day it is, what type of fly we want to present and how we want to present it, we need to choose a gear setup that matches what we want to achieve. I'd like to focus a bit on the action of the rod to start out with, because when you're fishing streams and rivers, you are met with other demands than if you're, for instance, fishing coastal or coastline fishing. When you're coastline fishing, you often have to have a fast taper in your rod because you need fastest possible line speed to achieve maximum distance. But when we're fishing a stream, we have to accommodate everything in between long casts to short casts, small flies, big flies, sinking lines, floating lines. And everything has an effect on what you need to be able to do. You also need to be able to cast with underhand casts, if you're limited in your surroundings and your space around you. And you also have to be able to deliver a long, precise cast. So what you need in the rod is basically a rod that gives you a bit of time to place your cast when you're underhand casting, placing your anchor or placing your cast in the air behind you in an angle that is equivalent of what you want to achieve when you aim for your goal. And all this comes down to the action of the rod. What we need when we're fishing in streams and rivers is a rod that works deep, bends deep down in the rod, that gives you time. But what you need when you then deliver your cast is a quick recovery so that it will enhance your line speed shooting across. When you want to test the action of the rod, what you do is you hold the butt of the rod up towards your lower arm and you hold it in a firm grip, and then you try to see how does the rod work when you make it move. How far down in the rod does it bend? This is the depth of the rod. You can see this rod is relatively deep because it works all the way down almost to the handle. What you then look for is how fast does the tip recover after have being bent. So if I do a stroke like this, I see how fast does it return to its relaxed state and how much does it vibrate. In this case, this is actually a good example of a deep action with a short stroke. It works down deep, but when I give it a stroke, it recovers fast and returns to a relaxed state with no vibration in the tip. There are many types of fly rods that have this action. So most producers today, they aim for getting this action in most of their rods really, unless they're like really saltwater rods. So many places to go. Then there is length of the rod. Most of my stream and river fishing is done with 10-foot single-handed rods. And that is because the extra length of the 10-foot rod gives me a bit more maneuverability. So if I'm moving the line out into the water, I have 1 foot more. It will give me some more space. And the same if I'm moving the line in to my own bank to gain more speed, I have more lifting power. So a 10-foot rod is ideal for most stream and river fishing for sea trout. In terms of the shorter rods, they can also be handy sometimes. This is a 9-foot rod. A 9-foot rod can be really helpful if you're fishing, in areas where you're restricted in your movements, if you have trees around you. Often when you have trees around you, on top of you, you fish in places where there's not as much vegetation as if you're out in the open. So the 9-foot rod is actually okay. And you don't have 1 foot more that can tangle up in the trees. Also, of course, if you're fishing really small streams, the 9-foot rod is the best choice. In terms of class and line weight, I really enjoy fishing lighter types of rods. So this is a 9-foot 5-weight. This is a go-to rod in very much of my fishing when I'm doing surface fishing, dry flies, nymphs, and smaller rivers. And now this particular rod is actually a 10-foot 7-weight, but I also have a 10-foot 5-weight, which I also really enjoy using for sea trout fishing, and I use it in most of my fishing. If I'm fishing really big flies, I choose a 10-foot 6 or 7-weight. Next thing we want to focus on is fly lines. And believe me, the fly line market has become a jungle. It's very hard to maneuver and find out what you actually want and need. So first off, we need to talk a bit about the length of the belly. When you choose a fly line for stream and river fishing, I prefer shorter bellied fly lines. A good belly is around from 6.5 meters to 7.5, 8 meters. The reason why I really like short belly tapered fly lines is because they're versatile and flexible. I can cast in places where I don't have much space, and I can also make a delivery on a relatively long distance. Nowadays it has become very popular to do what is called delta spay tapered lines. It means that you have a triangle taper of the line. You push the weight back into the line so it's close to the tip of the rod, and they are especially popular for spay casting. Some call it Scandinavian tapered, but the first were called delta spay tapers. Now, I really don't like these fly lines for sea trout fishing in rivers and streams. The reason has to do with two things. First, when you have all the weight placed in the back of the fly line, if you only have a short amount of line outside the tip of your rod, it's difficult to feel the load in the rod. The second reason is that if you have all the line out, then the shape of the loop becomes more like a V shape, and there's a tendency that the underline will fall in the cast, so it shoots out like this, and it stalls the line, and it becomes difficult to turn over a large fly. So I'm not a fan of delta tapered fly lines. What I particularly like are lines that has still a short belly, but where you have a relatively level taper of most of the line, a steep front taper and a small back taper. These lines fly more parallel in the air when you shoot them across. So it gives you more control in your cast, and it has better delivery, especially of larger, bigger flies. When you're looking at the line market today, it's very difficult actually to find these lines. You have Scientific Anglers SBT, their short belly taper is actually a relatively good line. However, it's really light, so you need to go up a few classes. So if you're casting, for instance, a 5-weight rod, you need a 7-weight actually, because they're so light. Rio has created the dart line. If you take the original one, the first version, it's actually really good. The second version they've made are delta spay tapered, so I would not prefer those. Vision has got some called Vibe 8.5. They're also okay. They have a bit longer front taper than what I really enjoy, but they're okay. So in fact, the perfect fly line for this type of fishing has not been developed yet. When we choose fly lines, we also need to talk a bit about density. Density could be floating, it could be intermediate, it could be a sinking line or a partly sinking line and a floating line. In my gear setup, I have 3 lines that I really enjoy fishing with. I have a floating line. I use that for surface strategies, nighttime, daytime, and if it's relatively low water. Then I have a fly line that is a float sink 3, whereas the 3 meters, the tip 3 meters are a sink 3 and the rest is floating. It gives you a line that hangs down a bit in the water and you can maneuver easily with the floating part of the fly line. And then I also enjoy sinking lines, entire sinking lines. These are effective tools for daytime fishing when you need to get down deep, which we've talked about earlier on. This is a sink 3 and a sink 5 could also be really, really good. Lastly, when we're talking about fly lines, we also need to talk about weight. Because today, if you buy a fly line that is a 7 weight, it can weigh anything from 14 grams to 18 grams. My system is so that if I have a 4 weight fly rod, I choose a 10 gram belly of the fly line. If I have a 5 weight fly rod, I use 12 grams on the belly. A 6 weight, 14 grams. A 7 weight, 16 grams. And if I have an 8 weight, 18 grams. Now, this can be discussed and debated. These work really well for me because they are a perfect combination between delicacy and precision. The last thing I want to focus on is leaders. Generally, I prefer tapered leaders. They can be made in monofilament or fluorocarbon. What I enjoy about these is that they are easy to use. You just have a loop in the end and then you attach it to the loop in the fly line. They're relatively light and they don't disturb the water that much when they land and one important thing if we're talking about monofilament leaders or fluorocarbon leaders against, for instance, poly leaders, is that a poly leader is relatively stiff and dead in the water. It's fine when it moves across, but when it comes into your own side, it lies more heavy in the water, it becomes more dense, and you don't have the same movement in your fly. The monofilament leaders, in my opinion, are better, even when you're fishing sinking lines. So I always, on my single-handed rods, use, and on my double-handed rods as well, use monofilament leaders or fluorocarbon. You can get them in different lengths. What I like is to use the 9-foot leaders because it's equivalent of the length of a single-handed rod in 9 foot. You can tie in a small tip, whereas if you're fishing with small flies, like for instance a smaller doubled hooked fly, you lengthen the leader. So I would be using, for this type of fly, I would be using 1.5 rod length leader material. But if I have to cast one of these really, really big flies with a heavy foam head, I will not be using 1.5 rod length of leader material. I'll be using a rod length because then I can turn over the fly. This also has something to do with choice of diameter in your leader. A very thin leader is excellent for small flies, whereas if you have a very thick leader, it's easier for the big guns. In tip, I use different types of, this is a fluorocarbon, but it could also be simple monofilament. and these I would use to lengthen my leader to create a tip. So if you've got a wallet of different tip material and a few leaders, a rod that matches the conditions where you're fishing and some fly lines that match the fly rod, then you're set to go. Now that we've talked about the tackle and the gear setup, we've moved down onto the water where it's time to talk about choosing the cast. Now, the physical conditions around you when you're at the fishing spot always determines the possibilities of your cast. And remember that we also have to put into our cast the type of presentation we want. Do we want the fly to come down, or do we want it to move across in the surface, or do we want to cast upstream or downstream or across? So the physical realities always determine our casting possibilities. This location is a place where I have loads of space around me and in behind me, so an overhead cast would be really good. Furthermore, I have some huge vegetation going out far out into the river, so this makes underhand casting really hard on a location like this. Earlier on, when we were talking about presentation, we talked about getting the fly down deep or letting it come across with speed on the surface. If I need to build this into my cast, there are two choices I need to do. If I want the fly to come down, I choose to do what is called a reach cast. Now, remember, we're fishing a stream, so that there is a current that drags the line into my own bank. So I need to pick the line up, angle it in the air behind me so it's ready to go in the direction I want. Do my back cast, I cast forward, then I stop in my front stop position. When I stop, I then move my rod upstream and back in again. This creates an arc on your line that gives it time to sink. We call this a reach cast. If, on the other hand, I want it to come across quickly on top of the surface, or if I want it to move across with speed, then I choose to do a different type of cast. Still, I start out by having my rod tip close to the water. I raise, I do the same type of angling, and then when I go forward, I stop the rod. But in this position, instead of going upstream, I go downstream. I bring the rod tip down close to the water and close to my own bank. Then I create a downstream, not an arc, but a downstream angle where the current will quickly grab hold of the line and start moving the fly. And then I can use my rod to quicken the pace of the fly across the stream. So these are the two choices I need to do if I'm fishing flies that I want to swing across using an overhead cast in a place like this. Sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you can't throw the line up behind you because of trees or obstacles. In this case, you have only one choice. It's the underhand or spey cast. Now, just to show you the basics in the underhand cast, imagine that we have a stream where the current is running that way. The line is on the dangle close to our own side. We then raise the rod to get some line off the water. We then start to circle with our body first, and then we close the angle to the back cast, making sure that the rod tip moves straight and then up. So we raise the rod, angle, and then we set the line, the leader on the water surface, and we use that tension to load the rod in our forward cast. So we raise, we circle, back cast, our front stop, and then we've made an underhand cast. This is basically the movements in it. Remember that you can also in an underhand cast put in an upstream mend or a downstream mend. As you can hopefully see, there are many different strategies you can apply to your sea trout fly fishing in rivers and streams. I really hope that we have inspired you to try out new things, either just because you find it interesting or because you find it exciting, or perhaps because you catch more fish. This concludes the first part of our series on the world of the sea run brown. We will be back with more, and we really hope that you enjoyed it.